Hello and welcome to AMP U Live with the Inquirer Live. I'm Ariella Cohen, Deputy Editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer's A More Perfect Union project. It's a series that's examining the roots of systemic racism in America through institutions founded in Philadelphia. In this latest installment of the series, White Picket Fence, we're looking at American suburbs, and we're sharing a story of how a Black family built a home on the main line in the face of restrictions that sought to keep them out. Through their story, reporter Zoe Greenberg offered a window into an American suburb that became an icon. Joining us for the discussion is Zoe, along with Brookings Metro scholar Andre Perry and Roxanna Wright, a musician and educator who grew up on the main line, raised her own family there, and still resides there today. Zoe met her in the course of reporting this story, and her story ended up shaping the story we are discussing today. But before we do that, we're going to take a moment to go back and watch a clip from the season 3 finale of Mad Men. So we're going back to the late 60s to a WASP American dream gone wrong. Can we see that video now?
You got everything you ever wanted. Everything. And you loved it. And now I'm not good enough for some spoiled mainline brat.
Spoiled mainline brat. So that was Betty Draper. And in that moment, we see how the main line lives in our pop culture. Rich, blonde, big house, white. How did the main line get so white? And that's one of the questions Zoe set out to answer when she began her reporting. And so I'm going to welcome Zoe to the panel. And Zoe, I'm hoping that you can walk us through the reporting that you did.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I love seeing that clip, the spoiled mainline brat. So as you said, I was very curious to know why the main line was so white. And I was also curious why the Black families who lived on the main line and who live there today all lived in certain very specific neighborhoods on the main line. So I wanted to understand that.
So that's a big question. Those are big questions. And we're talking about history that goes back, generations. Can you talk about how you started? How did you begin investigating these questions and what guided you?
Yeah, so I began just talking with lots of people who live on the main line, who could trace their families many generations back. And I hope that some of them are watching and you can, chime in the chat because I'd love to hear from everyone. But a few different people began mentioning these restrictions in deeds. So they said that their family members and relatives had encountered racial restrictions. And basically, these kind of racial covenants, it's a clause in a deed that basically says, this can't be owned, used, or occupied by anyone who's not of the Caucasian race. And so that's a deed, that's a clause that every time the house is bought or sold, that clause will apply. So, that shaped who could live where. And so that's actually how I found Roxanna Wright, who her family ends up being the subject of the story, because she had thought that her own, relatives had encountered a racial restriction in their deed.
And it turned out that they didn't have a racial restriction in their deed, but that you found racial deeds elsewhere. Can you talk a little bit about the subdivision across the street from where Roxanna's family lived?
Yeah, so basically, as you said, Roxanna's family did not have a racial restriction in the deed, but directly across the street, we figured out that there was a subdivision that was fully covered in racial restrictions. So it limited Black people from buying hundreds of homes. And so Roxanna's grandfather, when he bought a house in the 1940s in Ardmore, he could literally look out the window from the house that he bought and see hundreds of houses that he was not allowed to buy, that his children weren't allowed to buy, that any of his relatives were not allowed to buy.
And yet he was there, his family was there. And I mean, I thought it was interesting to me. I'm not from this area, to learn about the rich and vibrant Black community that existed in the main line. So he did buy, others did buy. Can you talk about kind of the exclusion that you learned about that they did face as you did your reporting here?
Yeah, so I think actually talking with Roxanna and talking with her daughter, Carla Garrison, talking with her grandchildren, it helped me kind of see that, you know, they didn't have a static experience of exclusion where, you know, in the 1940s, they faced this exclusion and that was the end. Instead, they kind of experienced these mutating forms of exclusion so that every generation actually looked really different. You know, it felt different to the different members, but it had this kind of generational impact throughout. So I think, you know, one really striking example of that was that Roxanna's grandson, Tony Goines, went to the Haverford School, a private school on the main line, and he was one of a few Black kids in his grade. And he just always felt like he really didn't belong. Like he, you know, like he was, as he put it, that he was a visitor there.
Can you flash that photo of Tony Goines, Angelica? So this is Tony Goines, who grew up and attended Haverford School, as you're talking about it. Can you tell us a little bit about the main line that he grew up in demographically and how that compares to the past?
Yeah, so Tony grew up right over the city line, and every day he went to school in Haverford Township, which today is about almost 90% white and just 3% Black. So you know, he felt like he kind of stood out there. And we looked at the census records, you know, going all the way back to when his great-great-grandfather bought a house, and it was very similar. It was majority white and, you know, quite a white place where not a lot of Black families were living on the Haverford Township side of Ardmore.
Despite Philadelphia being a predominantly Black city and the state having a larger population of Black and brown residents. So it was kind of a disproportionately white area within the region.
Yeah, and actually a professor, Craig Bailey at Villanova University, is writing a book on the main line and the development of Ardmore. And he found something really interesting, which is he found that wealthy white developers actually built roads in the 1920s sort of around the Black community there as a way of increasing their profits and making sure that the Black families couldn't move freely. So that's another, you know, it's just a reminder that things like these racial covenants in the deeds are sort of one tool in a suite of similar tools of exclusion.
Right. So some of the readers who read this story wrote in and they wanted to know how local officials responded to the discovery of the racial deeds.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I should just say before that, you know, we knew that this type of restriction existed on a national level. And actually, one great example of that is I spoke with folks at the University of Minnesota Mapping Prejudice project, and they've actually mapped 25,000 covenants across the county where Minneapolis is. The Philadelphia Fed has recently done an audit of deeds in the Philadelphia city limits. So we knew that these existed, but I had no idea that they existed on the main line. And when I brought them to town officials, they said that they had no idea. And so, the town officials said that it sort of helps to explain something about why why Haverford looks the way that it does today.
Interesting. And did they talk at all about what they've done to address racial inequities in the region?
Yeah, so they're
Yes.
Yeah, so they're doing, a few different things to address racial inequity. They're doing anti-racism training. They're trying to increase the number of minority contractors that they work with. But I think, in speaking with the town manager, for example, it just became really clear that, this is a huge history and it's quite a long one. And so some of the responses that the town is taking, it's like it's small steps for kind of a huge legacy of injustice.
Right. And it does seem from what you're saying about the multiple tools, the restrictive deeds, and then the roads that Craig Bailey is studying right now. Do you see any kind of systematic response to that from the township?
No, I haven't seen that, and I think that, this was one of the first times that they saw that these racial restrictions did exist in the area. And, for further research, I think it would be really interesting and important to see sort of a comprehensive mapping of where all the covenants were across the main line, and that has not been done.
Right. And that's rare. I mean, is there any part of the United States where such a mapping has been done?
A few different places are, attempting to do it. So Minneapolis is, Washington, D.C. is, I believe, some parts of St. Louis. So, I mean, it's definitely, an area of interest all across the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Well, I think we're about to welcome our other guests into our conversation. Before we do that, I want to put a new photo on the screen. Angelica, can we see the photo of Roxanna Wright and Carla, her daughter, and her granddaughter? All right, so we're just kind of setting the stage. And now we're going to welcome our other two panelists to the panel here. Hi, Roxanna. So great to see you.
I see you.
And hi, Andre. Wonderful to see you as well.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you guys?
Doing well. Great reporting, by the way. Great
Thank
reporting.
you.
Zoe.
Thanks.
So, Roxanna, I wanna start with you. So in 1942, your grandfather, Early Jenkins, brought a home on Aubrey Avenue in the Haverford Township section of Ardmore. What did that house where you grew up mean to you? And I'm also wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what that house meant to your grandfather.
That's an interesting story. From what I was told by my mother and by even my grandfather, some things. It came about because of the fact that my grandfather and his wife, that I'm named after, and his three children came up from North Carolina after the Depression. They lost everything. So they came and they lived eventually got an apartment in Bryn Mawr, and it was on Glenbrook Avenue. Those apartments, the first floor, it's usually the business area, the second, third floors where people lived. And my grandparents had an apartment in which it was one room in which they lived. The other one was one that they had other people who were going through the same things to live there. Well, it ended up that when the children, and it was a street, so there weren't really red line areas in Bryn Mawr. There were just certain streets that Black people lived on or African Americans lived on. And it happened that one day when, this is what we were told, when the children on this street on Glenbrook were playing outside. There was a family that owned a lot of the property, saw these children playing there, and they were all African Americans. And so the woman who owned this property evicted them. She did not want to see African American children playing on the street. That, in some way, got my grandfather to then find property in Ardmore on the Haverford side on Aubrey Avenue. Now, Zoe was really good in finding out about this deed. We knew nothing about that. All we knew was that my grandfather talked to my mother and her sister and brother. And from my understanding, the man who owned the home, he did not want to sell. And like Zoe said, there was no deed, but he did not want to sell to an African American, but he had to leave the property. We don't know why. So a gentleman who lived on Chestnut Avenue bought the property. He had the cash right then. So he bought it and then heard about my grandfather, and he sold it to my grandfather. So it meant a lot to my grandfather to know that this was a home that he was told he could not buy. There were other African Americans on the street. I don't know how many, but I know during that time when it was very difficult for people, they would take in other people. So my grandparents had done that. It meant a lot at that time that they owned their own property. Even though my mother, she was a senior in high school, went to Radnor High School. She took the bus back every day to go to school there. Her sister, my aunt Ladars, she ended up going to Haverford High School and graduating from there. So that house meant an awful lot to the family because of the fact that Aubrey Avenue, where we lived in the lower part of Lower Merion. Of Aubrey Avenue, I'm sorry. The upper part of Aubrey Avenue was predominantly European American. And the street that was sort of perpendicular to Aubrey Avenue was St. Mary's Road. That was all European American. And then down the street, there was another street, I think it was Oakford Road. That was all European American. And behind us was Cricket Avenue. And that was all European American. So when we crossed Aubrey Avenue on Cricket Avenue side, we were over in Lower Merion, and there were many more African Americans. That's where my father bought property, and he owned his cleaning business called Spring Cleaners, and that thrived an awful lot. So he was very much into the issues that dealt with African Americans, and they were mostly in Lower Merion. But the house itself, that was very interesting because when I was about to be born, my grandmother died 2 months before I was born. And so a year later, my grandfather remarried. And so my parents were looking for a home to buy. And he said, no. He wanted them to buy Aubrey Avenue. It meant a lot because of the issues that have been going on. So that's how that happened. And so my parents took great pride in that house and also making sure that they continued helping other people within the community and taking in children and parents and things like that.
Such a powerful story. Thank you for sharing it with us. And I want to show some of those photos. Angelica, can you show, these are historic photos that Roxanna, you so generously shared with Zoe and our photographer. Do you see that image? Can you just describe what you see there?
Oh, yes. Those are of my mother and my father. And then the large picture is of my mother. And they were, because I wasn't even born then, I was told, it was a big to-do, at least in the Black community, that they were married. My father went to school in Lower Merion, and of course, he graduated from Lower Merion, and my mother from Radnor. So it meant an awful lot in that time. And as a matter of fact, my mother kept the gown. And it's very interesting because one of my daughters, Nicole, she wore that gown when she got married. So it's really something that we've always kept. My mother was a historian in the family, but she was the mind behind a whole lot. My father was a politician, but my mother, she worked the magic. She knew how to do that.
Well, I want to show that picture of that NAACP meeting, actually. So tell us what you see here.
Okay, when you're looking at that, the woman with her hand on her hip, that's my mother, Clara Hazard, Clara Jenkins Hazard. And she was a no-nonsense woman, very quiet, but no nonsense. And in that picture, they are changing things over in Lower Merion Township. So because my father had a business there, they were very involved in the politics of Lower Merion, and they were pretty involved with the NAACP and the Ardmore Progressive Civic Association. And that's my mother there when they were trying to get people employed in the Lower Merion High School. And that's the NAACP and other people who were involved that lived in Bryn Mawr and in Ardmore that definitely were working towards this. But she was a major factor in that.
It's so interesting to me to see this and to see just this strong and vibrant history that is not really visible in our popular conception of the main line and of this area.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what it's like for you to have seen the area change over time. You know, you described growing up in an area where there was a large Black community. That population has over time gotten smaller.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? How does that affect you?
That's a good question. It's very interesting because all of our friends basically lived over in the Lower Merion area. There was one street that was Biddle Avenue, and it was like right across the tracks from Aubrey Avenue where my grandfather lived. So that had African Americans, but the majority of them lived in the Lower Merion side. So that meant an awful lot to us. And we only knew those streets really quite well. As a matter of fact, if we were on one end of Spring Avenue and we were talking, we'd say, okay, are you going to go over the road to all the way over to Holland Avenue? And if you were on Holland Avenue or what's part of West Spring Avenue, and you were going to the other side where I lived, you'd say, are you going over the road? So either way, you were always going over the road, and everybody knew each other. And I mean, I'm talking about Sundays. Oh my goodness. Everybody, whether they went to Mount Calvary Baptist Church or Bethel AME or Zion Baptist Church, everybody got dressed, and parents and children all went to church. So we were used to that. And we were not used to anyone driving along those streets that were of European background. They just did not come in that area. So we were very close. When the change began to happen, I was living then on Holland Avenue, where I live now. And we noticed that there were more people coming into the neighborhoods that had been African American, and they were more of European Americans, some Latinx people were coming in, and it was a strange feeling at first. This is an area that they did not at all come into, and I'm not talking about the minorities, but the majorities of European Americans never did, and if they did, they flew by the streets. But it was very interesting to see this, and it was a strange feeling at first, like, why are they here? They never were before. It didn't have anything to do with us, and now they're here. But then after a while, you got used to it, and as some of the Asians were coming in and the Latinx people were coming in, as well as the Europeans, they began to speak and to talk to us. And as a matter of fact, I asked one young lady, I said, well, why are you moving in here with your children? And she said to me, we want to have them live a more diverse life. We don't want them living just into the European neighborhoods. We want them to share and to know what it is to live in these types of neighborhoods. And I thought that was so interesting because when I was growing up, I asked my mother, why do I have to go to school in the Haverford schools? Because I was the only Black young child or African American child from elementary all through my elementary years. And why? And she said, because I want you to be comfortable with people who are of the European ethnicity.
Well, there was one story that you told Zoe about trying out for the cheerleading team when you were in high school. Can you just tell our audience that story?
Sure. It was in junior high school. I see someone wrote Dick Robenstein. Roberts. I'll get his name. That's sorry, Dick. He wrote about it, and I was in junior high school. They didn't call it middle school then; it was junior high school. And my neighbors, the Collinses, taught me how to cheer because they were phenomenal athletes. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be great. And a lot of the students were there. There was a huge audience, and we had to go on the stage. And I knew I was pretty athletic, and it ended up that I was not chosen. And it really hurt me because I knew I was pretty good at this. So I knew I was good at music, but I didn't really know that much, but I knew I could do that. So it hurt me to know that me being the only African American. Now in high school, there was another young girl, Jeannie Mills. She was also an African American and she got in, but this was in junior high. So I went in and told my mother, and my mother, very wise woman, she said, okay. So she and her sister, Ladars Love at the time, they said, we're going to South Philly. And they got the red wool and they made the skirt and they stitched it down from the waist down to I think it was the end of the thigh, all the way around, put the zipper in, everything. And then my mother bought the shoes for me because they didn't tell us what kind of shoes I was supposed to wear, where they got them. So she bought me black and white shoes that were not exactly like the other cheerleaders, but she did. And then she went to the school and said to them, now, tell me why, because they said that they didn't have enough skirts. She said, now tell me why my daughter cannot be a cheerleader. And boy, did that change. And I became a cheerleader in junior high school. So that's when that started. Very interesting situation. But that was one of the situations I went through there. And I went through some things even in elementary school that was very interesting. But that was the one in junior high school. My mother was a very wise woman. Thank God. Yeah.
Thank you. So some of the questions that were coming in the chat are looking at sort of how the fact that the exclusions happened on the main line, sort of how did it happen? Like someone is asking here, Riffle, what were the deeds a function of the real estate developers, or was it lawmakers, or was it a web of cooperation across systems? And Andre, I know you've done a lot of work on structural inequality, and I was wondering if you could just kind of talk through sort of the system that led to that exclusion.
Yeah, and I think the viewer got it right hit the nail on the head, that it's a patchwork of discriminatory practices using, as Zoe described, a suite of different of things throughout our history. And it's also important to note that we think about these things occurring during the New Deal, particularly because we learned that redlining, the practice of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which drew red lines around predominantly Black neighborhoods, denying them certain refinancing subsidies. And so we think of that as characterizing all of the discriminatory tools. But as this story points out, many of these practices were in play at the local level long before the federal government codified them or resourced them, scaling them up. And so you had governments, you had developers essentially using them, as the piece points out, as marketing strategies. And what they would do is artificially create a sense of value by excluding Black people. And artificially meaning that many of the neighborhoods that were deemed unworthy were not inherently broken. They were just predominantly Black. And many of the neighborhoods that were deemed worthy of investment and considered of high class were that because they were predominant or exclusively white. And so we created not only material sort of ways to shelter or hoard material goods for white populations, which led to better municipal services and resources, we also was also a way to deny Black people those very needed resources for things like schools and other things. And it's important to know that many Black people strove to, as this story points out, to acquire those goods that were deemed worthy, that were seen as being quote unquote good neighborhoods. But it's hard to tell if they were good neighborhoods, other than that they were exclusive. But Black people bought into the idea that these were the places that were desirable. And some of it was absolutely true. There was greater investment, better services. But let's be clear, a lot of those services could have been had in Black neighborhoods, but they were just denied over time. And so it makes for just a complicated story of not just about the economics of segregation, but the social aspects of segregation, which or Roxanna really brought out.
Yeah, it's really, it is a complicated history, like Zoe was saying, and Roxanna, and as you just echoed. And you use this word devaluation. Can you just define that for us? And Angelica, can you show the map as well as Andre's talking? And maybe zoom in. Yeah, we're zoomed in there. So can you tell us what devaluation is and how that manifests in this region here in the Philadelphia region?
Yeah, so when I study a lot of the structural racism that occurred over history, and we certainly have heard restrictive racial covenants in our neighborhoods. We've heard redlining, the practice of the homeowners loan corporation, which drew red lines around Black neighborhoods. We know that highway construction barreled through Black neighborhoods, the unfulfilled promise of urban renewal, and of course predatory lending. All of these factors have an impact, and I wanted to study those impacts. So what we did was we looked at home values in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher, and compared them to areas where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. And we controlled for, meaning we attended to everything from education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, so we could get an apples to apples comparison. And what we found overall, that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, there's about $156 billion in lost equity across the United States. In the Philly metro area, we see that play out in about 27%, about $37,000 per home. And what that represents is the money that people use to send their kids to college, to start a business, to move to a better neighborhood, to use when there is an inevitable economic shock. And so not only were Black people denied the ability to purchase homes, their homes, when they did own homes, their value, they weren't capturing their value, which means they're not passing on that value to their children in the way that they could have. I mean, Roxanna and others was robbed of millions and millions of dollars collectively that they would have passed on to their children. And people, families will say, hey, I turned out okay. But the reality is that many Black families have to take on student loan debt. They get worse interest rates when they're applying for a home. They struggle financially. And it's all because they're just not getting what they deserve. And it gets to that greater point that we've built value based on exclusion, not necessarily of around quality. That our ideas of quality, and this is particularly true in schools. When people say good schools, what they're really saying is we filtered out all the Black, brown people or the poor people. That doesn't necessarily make it a good school.
Right. Well, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to me that really resonated when I looked at that graphic of devaluation is kind of the impacts for a family like the Wrights, where you bought this home and the home that you could buy was in an area where it was a mostly Black area in a mostly white region, and the home went for less than some of the homes did in surrounding whiter areas. And you just have to wonder what role racism played, and think about how, despite all the barriers that you were able to overcome, that there was still this financial piece, this structural financial piece that was just sewn in there.
And and there's, you hear stories all across the country of people, quote unquote, whitewashing their homes. When seeking to refinance their homes, families obviously have to get an appraisal. Well, not obviously, but they do get an appraisal. They get a sense that it comes in low. And what many families are doing are they're removing all the Black artifacts from their home. So Roxanna's pictures in the background, she would remove them and replace them with white people on the wall. To take away the clothing, the books, the hair products, all of those things. And what these families are finding is when they get a second appraisal, it comes in sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars higher, which reveals the intrinsic value of whiteness in our housing markets. And so Black people shouldn't have to strip away their who they are, because in many ways it's stripping away dignity in the process. And so for me, people like Roxanna are, they make for a great story, because what they're doing everything that we are told to do to achieve the American dream, and they're not reaping the full benefits of that.
And one thing that A More Perfect Union is trying to do here is to think about the role that the Inquirer itself has played in perpetuating some of the inequality that is part of the American dream, as we learn more and more all the time. And so as we were doing this work, we found that many of the developments that did in fact have these racist, exclusionary restrictions written in, they were actually advertised in the Inquirer. Zoe, can you talk a little bit about what we found there?
Yeah, so we were specifically looking at one developer, and we found that the subdivisions that we could see had racial restrictions on them were advertised throughout the Inquirer throughout the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and they even said very specifically, things like wisely restricted, build your home, describing these kind of choice homes, desirable neighborhoods. And this was all a way that the Inquirer was actually, complicit in these racial restrictions.
Yep. And now we're going to take a couple of the questions from the audience. Can you explain a little bit more about how the building of roadways was a tool for racial restriction or segregation?
Yeah, so and I will cite Craig Bailey, who is a professor at Villanova, who is working on a book about this. So we should all buy his book when it's out. But basically, from how he described it, is that developers figured out that the further away from the Black community they built homes, the higher they could, the more they could charge. And so at this time, which was before kind of municipal services and utilities and a public building of roads, the developers were doing all of that. And so the developers built these roads kind of encircling the Black community, and then they built houses and charged more and more the further away that they got from those roads.
And let's not forget, there's one other factor. As we started to build up the suburbs, the federal government started subsidizing the building of freeways to the suburbs. And in many cases, it was a negotiation between the municipalities and the federal government of where to put those highways. And of course, Black communities didn't have the power. So many of those highways were built on top of Black communities where they were raised, and commercial districts destroyed, neighborhoods destroyed. So again, this is another example of there's local actions of discrimination that were essentially adopted by a federal government and scaled to make matters worse.
So now I'm gonna read a comment that we got in, and then I'm gonna ask one more question from the crowd. So I found this a really moving kind of testimony, and this is from a reader named Diane Showers, and she writes, in 1970, my typing teacher at Overbrook High School got me a job at Bryn Mawr College. Black students were sent to work various jobs while white students were being prepared to become lawyers and doctors. It was my first time exposed to the main line, and I was terrified. I boarded the train at 52nd and Lancaster with many black women. I had to step over feces, broken glass, and hold my breath because of the urine. The lights were all broken. Someone screamed at the top of the stairs, "Watch out for the cockroaches." When the conductor said Bryn Mawr, the black women, who all had large bags, got out into a long line of luxury cars driven by white women. I'll never forget walking by Shipley and Baldwin schools and noticing that all the black people were maids, janitors, or kitchen help. I will especially never forget walking on campus at Bryn Mawr College, where a white woman was walking her dog on the campus on the opposite side of where I was, and she made her dog run up to me and sniff me. So that's quite a detailed and a really resonant piece of writing. Thank you, Diane, for sharing your experience. And I think it speaks so well to some of the ambient racism on the main line and in this area, and how this exclusion kind of seeped through the culture. But I want to talk a little bit more about the systems as well. And so then we got this other question from Blake Bradford 215. He says, I went to Harriton High School in the 1980s. Can you share your perspectives or speculate on how residential segregation, the segregation we're talking about that was caused by some of these exclusionary tools, how that might have played out with the public schools?
I'd like to speak a little bit about that. For one thing, things have not changed that much. If I go back to my grandfather, and he became a cook at the Haverford Boys School, and he was not allowed, as a matter of fact, the headmaster would not allow them to even buy a car unless he approved of it. And when my grandfather also felt as though he became the head chef, and he was in the newspaper, but he said he should be getting the pay that he should as a head chef, and not as those that were employed lower than that. Particularly, he was being paid the same as those who were custodians that were African American. So he approached this man, and he knew his job was at stake, but he was determined because he had some kind of dignity about him. And he was capable of keeping his car and being able to get even more pay. That's one thing. And that was back in the, I think the 30s and 40s. Now you got me coming up to 1980. My three daughters, Carla, Nicole, and Jamie, all went to Harriton High School. Back in 1980s, I was teaching in the Philadelphia school system, but they had what we have now is the African American Month or African American Week at one time. And so they asked me, Mom, since you do performing arts and music, would you work with us, with the young people who want to present something during that week? So I said, okay, I'll work with you. And there were some young ladies who lived in the Lower Merion district. And we decided to put on the play for colored girls who considered the rainbow, considered suicide and the rainbow is enough. And so we worked at it and performed it at Harriton. Seemed to go well. The vice principal was with me. So she decided, let's take this over to Lower Merion High School. They performed there. I had no idea of the reaction. It was so negative. It was one, she called me and she said, I hate to tell you that the students, and I don't know if faculty was involved, but they called, they said, get this nigger play out. We don't want this kind of stuff. And I made up my mind and I said, you know what, Nicole, That's it. I'm not doing anything again. That's it. Let me just get you through high school. All I know is Harriton is a good school for all three of you. If I can get you through this and you'll do well, then you can go to an HBCU. But I want to make sure you get the best education, and Lower Merion is one of the top. Deal with it. Let's see if we can deal with this. I refused to do it. It took me years later that young people in the community said, please, please, would you work with us? And we did the play called The Me Nobody Knows. That worked out better. But to say things have not changed that much, I'm so thankful and grateful for Zoe for opening up this door that has been closed for so long about the issues that have happened within the African-American neighborhoods in Bryn Mawr and Ardmore. We've gone through an awful lot together. Harriton was not that easy to deal with, and I had been back and forth many times to stand up for my daughters. So yeah, it hasn't all been that great. There's been some wonderful things, but no. Thank you so much, Zoe, for opening that door.
And just very briefly, things certainly have not changed that much because racial housing patterns predict how much funding schools receive, and how much funding schools receive predict academic achievement. So if you live in a wealthier neighborhood, you probably go to a wealthier district, you probably have more resource schools. In addition, what I like about the story is that it points out that these white communities weren't free of Black people. They actually hired many Black women to clean their homes, and so oftentimes they lived in the homes, and in many cases rented in these areas, and so they just could not own, and were reduced in terms of just working in a certain class. So that's another aspect of around racial segregation we don't talk about. It wasn't as if these white communities, you never saw a Black person. In fact, many times Black women raised their children, cleaned their homes, cooked the meals. They just could not live or could not own. And that's the differentiating factor. Black people, particularly Black women during this time, did the labor, but they could not get the ownership. And that's where you see the outward just discrimination.
Right. And the generational and the wealth gap that you've written so much about today.
That's right.
You are so right about this. My father's mother was one. She was a domestic worker, and there were times she could not bring my father in the house as a young child.
That's right.
And she had to stay there for a while. He had to live with other families.
Wow.
So you're absolutely right about that. Thank you.
So we're getting to our closing time, but I want to leave our audience with one closing question from the audience. So we got a question from Sarah McCafferty, and she wants to know, what are some things that township officials can do to address the harmful policies of the past? And I'd love to hear from Andre, kind of models nationally, and I'd also like to hear, Roxanna, if you have any thoughts on this.
There's a couple things, and it all falls in the area of reparations. We see local communities actually providing reparations to individuals. We see Evanston, Illinois, Asheville, North Carolina, states all across the country recognize that people have been denied the housing subsidies and denied ownership, and we have records of this. People are still alive. In addition, along with that, we have got to acknowledge that these things exist. That when things go wrong in Black neighborhoods, we blame Black people. We don't look at the exclusionary policies that rob people of the material resources that are used to lift themselves up. And that is certainly true in Philadelphia, because people will always say, look at the murder, look at the crime. And we all don't want that. But you don't solve it by blaming people. You solve it by resourcing people, giving them an adequate place to live, giving them adequate education, and all those adequate policing and the like. But when you just blame people, you miss the reason why folks ended up in a certain strata. And so, but again, there's ways that we can repair by actually restoring the value that's been extracted by racism. And the reason why the the suburbs were built up in the first place because we created policies that were exclusive to whites. And people were down and out. They were, it was depression. And guess what we did? We created policies for some and burdened others. So we can get out of this by investing. Call it something else. Don't, if you're offended by reparation, call it something else. Call it the next New Deal. Something else. But we can actually repair the damage because we actually have the records of it, and we can create the calculations for repair.
Thank you, Andre. And Roxanna, do you have any thoughts about what local elected officials could do?
My interest is in the educational part, and thank you, Andre. You're wonderful. And I'm working with an organization, Power Mainline, and I work with the NAACP. And our thing is to get African American studies within the curriculums, within the school systems. So we are working right now. We're focused in Lower Merion. It took an African American teacher to get, I think it was literature in the high school, 10 years to get it in there, and not as a core course, as an elective course.
Wow.
We are so determined, and this is Lower Merion, and this is going throughout the main line. All of this is going on. People are fighting this, so afraid of the critical racial theory, all of the other things that was started by an African American woman who did this within the studies at college level for law students, putting that out there like a monkey wrench instead of dealing with the issues. We are determined that we're going to get African American studies throughout the curriculums in Lower Merion. We're working very hard with the superintendent, who he's struggling and he's trying very hard. But if we can figure this out and get a strategy, then we're going into Haverford, then we're going into Radnor, then we're going into every aspect and every area that we can, because of the fact that young people need to know the true history. Thank you so much.
Wow, what a powerful note to leave on. We've all learned so much history. Thank you so much. I just want to again thank our audience for joining us here today. This has been a really interesting conversation for me. I hope it was for you as well. And to read Zoe's article, White Picket Fence, as well as the previous articles in this series, you can visit inquirer.com/moreperfectunion. You can also sign up for a free newsletter to receive notifications about future articles as they publish. Until then, keep following the Inquirer Live series, and our next More Perfect Union Live will be about our next chapter around mass incarceration. I'm your host, Ariella Cohen, Deputy Editor for More Perfect Union, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you again for joining us.